Guess what day it is?
Oh,
It's French Fry Day, it's French Fry Day, so grab your fries and say hooray! David French is here to play on French Fry Day. It's French Fry Day.
Hey, David, welcome back.
well, I'm glad to be back. I enjoy this, Skye.
It's the end of summer. Labor Day is upon us. Do you have any big plans for the long weekend?
Maybe going to Chicago, but undetermined as of yet. So
To visit family, I'm
to
assuming?
visit family, yes, my family that is now, for at least for 2 weeks, are now Chicagoans and loving the city. Skye, they
Good.
love Chicago. They're in Hyde Park and love it.
Good. Well, if you come to Chicago this weekend, you'll enjoy the weather because it'll feel just like Tennessee. It's supposed to be like 95 degrees.
Is that right?
Yeah, it's going to be hot. Actually, it's exactly what I want to talk to you about because you wrote a column recently about your daughter and son-in-law and grandkids leaving home and moving to Chicago for law school. Your piece is called 3 Generations Under One Roof. And it's a little change of pace for you because you're not talking about law, you're not talking about politics, you're not talking about religion. You're talking about your own kids and grandkids and the dynamic of this transition that you and Nancy have been going through with people in and out of your home. I read this Sunday morning while I was having my tea, and you pretty much had me in tears
Oh,
because of it just hit at a moment where
Yeah.
the week before I had taken my 2 oldest kids and dropped them at college, including my son, who's a freshman.
Yeah.
And we have one daughter left at home, and both my wife and I are like, this feels different. This is different than when we just had one away and 2 were
Yeah.
home. It's a very different dynamic, and we're still getting used to it. So we'll kind of just go all over the place with this conversation. But at one point in the article, you talked about a mix of pride and sadness of when your kids left for college. Talk to me about that and where you fall in that mix of pride and sadness when in these transitions.
Yeah, it's interesting. I was talking to my parents about this, who were always so great with me in the sense that when I wanted to go away for college, they were for it. When I wanted to go further away for law school, they were for it. When I came back home after I got married and we were living literally next door to each other, I wanted to go out back to Northeast to teach at Cornell Law School, and they were for it. But they were also really sad, obviously. They did a good job of concealing it. They did a good job of really not letting me in. But I was talking to them and I said, I think I'm getting where you guys were coming from, where you can be 100% happy for your kids, 100% certain that they're on the right path, they're doing the things that they need to do, and have real joy in that. Like when my oldest daughter and her husband both got into the University of Chicago Law School, miracle of miracles, one of the best law schools in the country, I was unreservedly ecstatic for them. And then 3 seconds later, when I thought, oh, that means Camille and Jarrett and my 2 grandchildren, who are all living with me, are going away, and they're going away soon. I had 2 reactions. One was denial. So I just pushed it off. I pushed it out of my mind, didn't think about it, tried my best. I have a gift for not thinking about bad things until they come up. But when it happened, when it came up to leave them, I was both 100% happy for Camille and Jarrett and really bereft, really sad for myself and for Nancy. And that dual, it was really, those dual emotions are at war in your own mind and your own heart, because you would never say to them ever in a million years, don't go to Chicago Law School, right?
Yeah, right.
And that would even be the wrong thing to say to them. But at the same time, man, it hurts. And especially hurts, Skye, when also going with your daughter and your son-in-law are a 2.5-year-old toddler who has been in your home for all but 6 months of her life, and a 5-month-old who's been in your home for every last second of his life ever since he came back from the hospital when he was born.
Well, that part I cannot relate to because I'm not a grandfather yet and I'm in no rush. But Okay, I want to kind of talk to you. This is a little different. I kind of want to talk to you as an older brother in this scenario, because you're quite a bit older than me. You're decades and decades older than me, right?
So much older.
No, so much older. But so this is the first time I've been going through this. Now, my oldest left for college in 2020, and it was weird because it was COVID, and it was just it was very, very messy. And she's at my alma mater. And it was weird because when we dropped her at school, my wife and I were driving away from campus, and that's when it really hit me. And I said to my wife, the last time we were in a car together driving this road, it was coming away from my graduation. And we just dropped our daughter at the school. And that's when it hit me where, gosh, 20 years, almost 20 years had just gone by like a snap. But my son is now at the same school, and we dropped both of them last week. And I hate to like do therapy in the middle of this podcast, but like I feel my age all of a sudden, and you just realize like the most significant job I've ever had, which is being a dad, at least a dad of children, is rapidly coming to an end, and it's a weird transition. So as somebody who's been through at least that part before, and now you're feeling it in a different degree with your daughter and son-in-law going off to grad school with their own kids. Like, what helped you navigate that transition?
Oh, to me, it was there's an easy answer to that question as to what helped navigate.
Okay.
And that was almost immediately after the kids went to college, we realized we're still parenting them. So, yeah, I mean, and that sounds weird to say, but in many ways, in those first months of college, we did more parenting than we did sometimes in a whole year of high school, in the sense that they were going through something entirely new, right? They were enduring new kinds of stresses, and we have a close relationship. And so we were able to, and very quickly were able to, really be a part of their lives, even though they were distant. Not in a helicopter parent sense, because we're not helicopter parents. Like, I remember there's a moment in early high school, or maybe late middle school, where our oldest daughter, we were sitting and waiting for her basketball game to start, and there were all these other parents that were scattered around the gym that were busy helping their kids with their homework. And I pointed to those parents and I said, you know what, Camille? That will not be us, because it is not our homework. It is your homework.
You've done enough homework.
Done enough. So we were not like the hovering parents.
Right.
But, we still have a very close relationship with our kids. And so therefore, when they were going through these new experiences, they quite naturally reached out to us, for conversations and guidance and advice. And it was that knowledge that we're still parenting that really in a lot of ways kind of helped us get through it, because it was not like we were just dropping them off. And when I was dropped off at college, I would call once or twice a week. There wasn't the text messaging, the instant access, the hey mom and dad, I just saw a cool thing, let me send a picture of it, that kind of thing. And so it was that connection, that continued connection really did help. But again, there's a peril in that, Skye. There's a peril in that, and so you can't look at it as an unmitigated good that you're still that closely connected. You want them to be independent. You want them to feel that sense of independence. But at the same time, there's nothing wrong with staying close to your kids. And by staying close to your kids, it really does sort of, start to heal that wound that you feel in your heart.
Yeah, the technology is a double-edged sword. I do appreciate the fact that we have more contact, but you're right. You don't want to stifle their own independence and development and growth. And really, when I reach out to them, sometimes I can say I'm doing it for their sake. I'm doing it for my sake.
Yeah.
Okay, so here's the other part of your column. I'm probably that impacted or just struck a nerve with me, an emotional nerve that I wasn't prepared for. And that's your granddaughter.
Yeah.
Lila, is that her name?
Lila, yes.
So when she was born, you and I texted a little bit about it. I don't know if you recall this. I'm sure it was a pretty harrowing moment for you guys as a family, because she had been diagnosed with all kinds of challenges. She was born on December 15th, 2020. And I remember our texting because that's my son's birthday. He was born December 15th, 2004. And he was born in an emergency situation, premature, had lots of health challenges for months, even his whole first year of life. We had some really bad diagnoses early on that we pretty sure we were going to lose him. He's a healthy 18-year-old boy, man, and you know, just went off to college. But reading your column made me live again that trauma of his birth, and overwhelming gratitude for the journey we've been on with him, and the fact that he's, you know, a healthy young man now. But oh my gosh, when you've had a kid that's had that in their background, you just these transition moments of life, whether it's, you know, they go off to school for the first time or off to college, they just have this added weight to them in a way. So I'm curious, just beyond what you shared in the column, how did you reflect on those things with your granddaughter and her leaving home?
Well, you know, it really, for me, helped ease my heart, because there's something, this is going to sound a little bit strange, but there's something that kind of wounds your spirit more about dropping off a toddler than your 20-something daughter who's about to start University of Chicago Law School, because we'd already dropped off Camille for college, right?
Right.
And then in many ways, them coming back and staying with us in the midst of the Lila health crises and other challenges was a bonus time. It was an unexpected time to spend with your adult daughter after she was married, even, Skye, that you never thought you would have. And so you're sitting there saying, well, I'm really going to miss them when they go. But this was all bonus. This was all unexpected, an unexpected blessing to be able to be together. So you've already said goodbye once. You're saying goodbye again, and it hurts. It definitely hurts. But because you've just come out of that unexpected bonus, it just feels differently. But there's something about when you drop off a toddler and a baby, and they've been with you since birth, and they're not young adults, it feels wrong. Now, I know it's not. That's so silly and nonsensical to say, because it's their child, right? It's Camille and Jarrett's kid. It's our grandchild. But when you've been with them, you know, you've seen the first steps, right? You have changed the diapers. You have helped put her to sleep at night when the parents are struggling to put her to sleep. All of the things, right, that you do when a toddler lives in your house or when an infant lives in your house. That's Lila and Ezra. And then all of a sudden you're dropping them off. You don't drop off toddlers, Skye. And so, again, I know it's not, you know, you're not dropping off a toddler. She's with her mom and dad, and all's great and all's fine. But it just kind of does something to you that's a little bit different. And part of it is the issue that they don't understand. So, you know, I put in the piece, Lila, when Nancy and I and Naomi were getting in Austin, we were all getting ready to leave Camille and Jarrett and Ezra and Lila. Lila says brightly, "Are we going home now?" Speaking of our house, where that's the home she's known, right? And Nancy has to say to her, "No, you know, sweetie, you are home." And she just doesn't get it, right? And that like, there's that gut punch there. But what I would say is, even in that gut punch, I had this voice in the back of my head that says, this gut punch is a blessing. This moment, these tears, they're all a blessing. Because there was a time when we had tears, but it was a very different kind of tears. And it was tears that she's not going to make it. Everything's not going to be okay. And then here you have this wonderful, healthy, smart, you know, cute, sweet little girl. And yeah, it really hurts to drop her off, but it's such a wonderful blessing that she's talking to us and saying, you know, am I going home now? And so it really did remind me of God's blessings in that moment. As sad as I was, remembering back to those early days and how fearful we were, quite frankly, it just reminded me of the blessing that we've been experiencing these last 2.5 years.
So you've captured something that I want to talk to you about, which is not in your piece. Parenting in general, and grandparenting, I imagine, is this way as well. Like, it's this paradoxical mix of pain and worry and struggle with unimaginable blessing and joy and gratitude. It's this, and I'm sure you've seen the surveys of people at the end of their life, and they are asked what was the most gratifying part of your life, and the most frequent thing people say is my family, my children, my grandchildren, those relationships. One thing that's caught my attention, I've been reading more about lately, is the declining birth rate in the United States, and particularly among millennials, Gen Z. Some of the statistics that are coming out about not just their delaying of having children, but their reluctance to have children at all. And Brookings did a report on this not too long ago. AEI, Jonah's operation, did a thing about shifting priorities for these generations, and some people attribute it to cost of living is so high, careerism, workism they call it, or lack of adequate childcare, all these kinds of economic things. But there seems to be more than that going on, that there's a diminishment of the value of parenting and having children because it infringes so much on personal freedom, and it certainly does. Obviously, you don't feel that way. I don't feel that way. But what do you think it says about our society or culture that increasingly young people are going, I don't know if I want to have kids?
Yeah, it's really interesting. And, it's interesting. This is something that I don't think is necessarily all that new. It's funny. I've known a number of people that when they were younger said, I don't know if I want to have kids. And then the instant they got back that positive pregnancy test when they were married, it was like, oh, this is the best thing that's ever happened. There's like a switch that turns off. But it's really interesting, Skye. I've been looking at this issue for a long time because the issue of declining birth rates is it's one of the most significant issues, not just in the United States, in human civilization.
That's right. And huge economic implications, social lots of implications.
Huge. Yeah. And so what we see is that across every advanced developing society in the world, regardless of ideology, regardless of governmental system, all of them have declining birth rates as they have gotten more prosperous. Right. You can go back to the great competitors of the Cold War, the United States and the Soviet Union. Both of them, the more their economies got advanced, the birth rate went down. Now, there's some exceptions. Israel, for example, is an exception. But outside of like that one very small outlier, this is the general rule. And so I think there's a lot of things going on at once. So here's one is I think that just quite frankly, the lack of birth control in the past meant that it's not that people were saying, hey, let's have a large family. You're living together with your wife, you're having a large family. And so this was just inertia. This is just human beings living together. It's biology. It's the combination of biology and inertia. And so then all of a sudden people begin to have a choice. And so they decide, and in a lot of these large family lives, we look back at them in a nostalgic way, maybe, not having experienced them. And
for sure,
a lot of the people who experienced them said, I don't know that I want to replicate that. Even today, when you find some people who've come out of like the Quiverful movement or some of these movements that put a real premium on very large families, some of the older siblings actually turn out to be sort of quite hostile to having not just large families, but families, because they feel like they've already raised kids.
That's right. Yeah.
And so when you give people more choice, it's a truism across civilizations that they choose to have fewer kids. So that's one thing. Then another thing is we've also kind of changed our philosophy of marriage. So it's now, what's the phrase that's used now? That it's a capstone as opposed to a building block of your life. In other words, even going back 25, 30 years when I was in college, there was an expectation that one thing that happens almost immediately after you graduate from college was you get married. And I had a lot of high school classmates who did not go to college and got married pretty quickly out of high school. I had classmates who got married in college. I married Nancy while she was still in college. And this was a part of kind of an understanding that you grow up together. Marriage isn't something that happens when you are fully formed as a human being and you need another person who's fully formed as a human being, and you are, the soulmate that was kind of building all to this moment. It was, no, you meet somebody when you're young, you fall in love, you get married, and you experience that growing up life together. So that's kind of the building block notion of marriage. Now there's kind of a capstone notion that says, once you finish school and you've become quite, at least you have both feet under you in your career, and you feel like you're in a headspace or an emotional place where you're mature enough for marriage, then you will get married. Well, when you have that capstone view, you're older, right? Now, it does turn out that sort of these capstone marriages tend to be pretty stable.
Right.
And
okay, let me pause you there for a minute. I got married a year after college. I was in grad school. I was 23. My wife was 22. So similar to you guys, we got married pretty young. And I get the capstone argument, but there's also this dynamic, and there's been a lot of research on this. People refer to it as delayed or prolonged adolescence.
Yeah.
Where I think as a 23-year-old, maybe I'm looking back with rose-colored glasses, I think I was more mature than most of my peers at that point. In various ways, emotionally mature, whatever. And not that I was fully formed. I wasn't by any means. But I didn't think it was a crazy idea for me to be married at 23. I look at some 23-year-olds in my life, and I'm going, they should not be getting married. Like there is this prolonged adolescence in the sense that you can stay on your parents' health insurance till you're 26 now. And the data coming out for this generation, they're taking longer to get their driver's license, longer to get a job, longer to date somebody, longer to, like all these various marks of maturity that we hit in high school or college, they're not hitting until much later. And some people would argue that there's an economic reason or incentive to keep people in an adolescent way of operating because that's good for stupid economic decisions that fuels the economy. So is it really that people are waiting for the capstone, or we've romanticized adolescence so much that nobody wants to leave it?
Yes, to both.
Yes. So even if you can argue get married as a foundation rather than a capstone, that foundation isn't there until people are 26, 28, 29.
Yeah, it's interesting. Now, we're pretty countercultural in our family. So Camille and Jarrett got married when they were 19 and 20. So Camille got married
that
after
is definitely not the norm.
Yeah, so got married after her freshman year of college and after Jarrett's sophomore year. And a lot of people thought they had lost their minds and that we had lost our minds for saying yes to this. But we also knew and know our daughter, and we know our son-in-law, and we were thrilled. We were very, very happy for them. And Camille, quite frankly, at her 19 was a lot more mature than my 19. So I think my older kids actually in some ways have been got more mature earlier than I did, as sort of remembering into the deep recesses of history of my late teens and early 20s. But yeah, there is definitely something to this notion that we have delayed a lot with our kids. And this is a bigger discussion about that whole concept of helicopter parenting that I talked about earlier. And I just tweeted out something in my very small amount of time I spent on Twitter now compared to Threads, but just tweeted out something that Jonathan Haidt said that was really interesting. We're overprotective of our kids in the real world, and we're underprotective of our kids in the online world. And
I saw that, right.
And I think there's a lot to that overprotective in the real world. It's just a fact that a lot of the markers of independence are coming later in life now. It's just a fact. And I was talking to my friend Greg Lukianoff, who is Jonathan Haidt's co-author of the book, The Coddling of the American Mind. And he was talking about how they will sometimes ask audiences of Gen X, I'm Gen X, how old were you when you left the house completely on your own? In other words, you didn't have a parent holding your hand, you walked out the door, and you were expected to come back at a certain amount of time, and there was no adult supervision in between. And for these Gen X parents, the answer was maybe 8 years old, maybe 9 years old. That's my answer.
Yeah, me too.
I would walk out the front door and head out, man. And I was supposed to be home for dinner. And then
my mom had a bell outside the back door of the house,
right,
that she would ring, that we could hear from, like, I don't know, a 5-house radius, and we would hear that and come back like dogs.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. So then they turned around and they said, well, how old were you how old were your children when they were out of the house with no supervision? And the normal answer that they would get, that Greg told me they would get, is about 14.
Wow.
And so now part of this is the way childhood has changed. I mean, for example, when I was young, this sort of notion that you're going to have this continual sports life of supervised sports play all through summer, for example, that was fiction. You might have a short little league season or something like that, but you didn't have programming all the time. And now this is more of an upper middle class phenomenon, but kids of upper middle class parents tend to have much more programmed lives. Mm-hmm. And so that has a lot of consequences, some of them good, some of them bad. Some of the bad consequences include less independence, and also a default view that disputes are to be resolved by somebody else,
right,
rather
a referee,
than
a coach, a parent, a teacher.
Exactly. Yep. And you talk to university administrators, and they will tell you that they have noticed a change in the incoming freshmen in the recent years, that whereas incoming freshmen used to have a view of leave me alone towards administrators, they now have a view of save me from the people I don't like.
Yeah, like you, I've spoken at a lot of colleges and universities, and sometimes I'll have a lunch with administrators or, college presidents, whatever. And I will often ask them, especially if they've been in higher ed for some time, what's changed? Yeah. And I get the same kind of responses. I had one conversation where someone in student life was telling me that, one of the basic skills they try to teach incoming freshmen is just how to resolve basic conflicts. You're with a roommate, you're living with somebody who, whatever, how do you resolve those things? And they said that doesn't really work anymore because of the cell phone, back to mom or dad. When there's a conflict between two roommates, the first time that the RA or the resident director or whoever finds out about it, it's when they're getting a phone call from the parent 3 states away. Mm-hmm. And they say, you need to get my kid a new roommate. And I'm like, well, what happened? Rather than talking to the roommate, rather than talking to the RA, they're texting home to mom or dad with their problem. Mom or dad contacts the school administration, and then they're pulled in. And so two people who occupy, a tiny little room don't know how to talk to each other about a conflict anymore because there's an authority figure, mom, dad, or the administration, who's going to come in and solve this for me, so I don't have to go through the awkwardness of confronting my roommate about his dirty underwear on the ground. Yeah,
it's funny. And a lot of this, let's be honest, is Gen X parents reacting against some of the experiences they had as kids.
Sure.
So a lot of us were latchkey kids. I was a latchkey kid for a while. I had the best home. Like I sometimes feel guilty when I hear about other people's home lives, about how good my home life was. I had a wonderful home life. So when I say I was a latchkey kid for a while, I'm not complaining at all. But my version of being a latchkey kid was I'd come home, open the door to my house, get my chessboard, get on the front porch, and then my across the street neighbor, who was also latchkey, would come over and we'd play chess until our parents got home. So it was not a dangerous situation for me. No bad things happened. But there are people in my peer group, because remember, Gen X is sort of the first generation that's dealing with divorcing parents, right?
Right.
That's dealing with a lot of family disruption. So a lot of that freedom was not healthy freedom. And so a lot of people who are my age experienced some real darkness in that time. And sometimes a lot of that freedom turned dark for them. There were bad things that happened. And so they want to protect their kids from some of the bad things that happened to them, which is an incredibly understandable impulse. But as often the case with us and culturally, we kind of fling from extreme to extreme. That, okay, we can acknowledge that maybe turning your 9-year-old loose and having a latchkey existence is maybe suboptimal, right? Okay, we can acknowledge that that's suboptimal, but then we can say, but the extreme correction is suboptimal as well. The one that says, hey, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16-year-olds can never handle their own business. A parent's always got to do it. There's a real problem in that. I learned to handle my disputes with my peers, myself. It was the rarest of rare things whenever a parent got involved in a dispute between kids.
I agree. It's remarkable how I talked to my wife about this. Like, it's remarkable how much we know about our kids' lives as teenagers, high schoolers, even college students, that our parents had no clue what was going on in our lives or relationships, because we were just so much more independent.
Yeah.
So to wrap up this conversation, it's an interesting trajectory when you look back at Gen X childhood, and your point being we were the first generation that grew up with no-fault divorce and sometimes some of the trauma caused by absentee parents, to our generation as parents perhaps being too helicopter, or now there's the snowplow parent phenomenon that over-parents. And we're getting early data on millennials and Gen Z as they reach adulthood, who increasingly are either delaying parenthood themselves or opting not to become parents at all.
Yeah.
And it just makes you wonder, where are we headed as a society if this trajectory were to continue?
You know, it's interesting. I think it's so many things at once. So you have, number one, when people have more choice across cultures, they're having fewer children. Number two, if you have a capstone model, that means you're getting married later, which means at the very least, it is actually then, because of biology, harder to have kids.
Right.
The later you start trying to have children, the harder it is to have children, and the shorter the window to have children. So if you get married when you're 31 and you decide when you're 34 or 35 to start having children, it's just a shorter window. So that means there's going to be fewer kids, and it's often harder. And then there's this interesting thing also where prosperity also, I think, moves us towards fewer kids, in the sense that life, when the more prosperity you have, it, in many ways, I think it makes life more like an amusement park. You're able to do cool things. You're able to go to cool places. You're able to own cool things. You can be, the more prosperous you are, it can orient you towards self-indulgence.
Right.
And so self-indulgence is in many ways an anathema to parenthood. And you're not going to be a good parent if you have a default sort of self-indulgent mindset. And so I think, again, you know, a lot of what we're talking about is a more upper middle class phenomenon, but you also have a lot of people who have a lot of economic opportunity young and get in a habit of sort of life on their terms. You know, they get in the habit of, I want to go for the long weekend. Now I'm going to go. I'm going to have this cool vacation. I'm going to eat this great food. And so when you get in that pattern of doing what you want to do when you want to do it, parenting is a massive disruption to that. It is a
Absolutely. Well, I mean, that gets back to your point about, as societies become more prosperous, they have fewer children. And part of that, at least in the modern setting, is more prosperous countries tend to be more capitalistic and consumeristic. And the message we receive growing up in those societies is that life is all about the consumption of goods and experiences and the satisfaction of personal desire. And nothing infringes on your personal satisfaction and consuming desires than a baby.
Right.
Like they completely disrupt. I remember that shock to my system when we had our firstborn, and you have that horrible awareness that I am never going to get to sleep in ever again.
Yes, right.
Right, until they're teenagers. But I didn't think about that when then we bring this newborn home. It's like, oh my gosh, I am now completely a victim of that child's sleep habits. Like you learn to live outside of your own desires. That's part of what parenting is. And it is completely countercultural to everything our capitalist consumer society forms us to value. And so it makes sense that children would be a massive infringement and barrier on that, and we would have fewer of them.
You know, it's an interesting paradox, because a lot of people who are very concerned about declining birth rates, and rightly so, I'm right there with them. It's interesting. A lot of their solutions, which involve even greater degrees of prosperity, that allow, say, a dad to work and the mom to stay at home. And by that they don't mean it isn't like right now you can have a family. Right now you can have families where the dad works and the mom stays at home. Happens all the time, but there are often quite meaningful trade-offs attached to that.
Sure.
Smaller house, fewer cars, less exotic vacations, all of these things. And so what ends up happening is a lot of people who start off on that path look at other people who have two working parents and who have the bigger house and more cars and the cooler vacations, and they say, yeah, I kind of want that too. And so they want, they want it all, right? And so a lot of people say, well, we need more broad-based prosperity to adjust or reverse the declining birth rates. And I'm thinking, I don't think it'll have the effect that you think it's going to have, because the more broad-based prosperity doesn't necessarily always work out to say, well, we have the cushion to have kids now. It often works out to, we're going to live up to the standard of living that we have, whatever it is. If you make $75,000 a year, $150,000, $300,000, whatever it is, people tend to live to that lifestyle and then say, well, then how can we add a baby when we're already paycheck to paycheck? When they don't have to be paycheck to paycheck wherever they are, but that's just kind of how we live. And that broad-based prosperity means that people have more fun, they make more financial commitments, and then when they're in this life where they have more fun and they have the more financial commitments, they say, well, we can't afford a kid now. When a parent 4 generations would say, what are you even talking about? You can't afford a kid.
Yeah. And that gets to what I was reading in the Brookings Institute report on dropping birth rates, is that it ultimately comes from a shift in priorities.
Yes.
If the priority and value is having children, we will find a way to make that work. I'm not saying that's true for everybody. There are definitely some people who are in dire economic circumstances where adding children to a household will reach the breaking point financially. But for a lot of Americans, it's just that they don't value having children the way prior generations did for whatever reason. Therefore, we don't prioritize our financial lives to accommodate the reality of children. Now, on the flip side, there are some things which are just demonstrably more expensive. It's more expensive to educate and pay for college than it was a generation or two ago. But yeah, I don't want to completely poo-poo the economic strain that children have on a household.
No, I don't.
But again,
Right.
there's a priority value shift here that we can't ignore.
And it's not just economic. So it was a very interesting reality to talk to other people about because Camille and Jarrett were high school sweethearts. And Camille came to us in her freshman year and said, if we do what sort of the world says we should do, which is don't get married until at the very least you finish college, or preferably until you finish graduate school. And they both wanted to go to graduate school. We'll end up dating for 9 years. And, look, I was out of law school when Nancy and I got married, but she was a junior in college. And so we have a 5-year gap, but we got married when Nancy was in college. And we said, you can get married in college. It's okay. That's what my parents did. You can do it. Mm-hmm. It's not like you're going to starve. And we know you're a mature person, a mature Christian. We know Jared is a mature Christian. We love you. We love Jarrett. We love you both together. You get married. Didn't realize they would, he might propose like 3 weeks after that. But it was really interesting, the reaction. The reaction was, there was one that was, are they mature enough? Totally
Sure.
Fair, great question, when we thought and prayed about in pondering all of this. But then a lot of the rest of the questions, well, aren't you supposed to have fun in college? Why are you presuming they're not going to have fun together when they're in college, right?
Yeah.
Isn't this the time to sow your wild oats? Wait, what?
Where's that in the Bible? What verse is that again?
Even heard that from Christians.
Yeah, of course.
So this is your time to sow your wild oats. You're not going to have enough money. Wait, actually, they're going to have more when they live under the same roof and are combining their resources rather than living in two separate places and paying two separate rents. So they're actually better off financially. But again and again, it was something about fun, something about money. The one valid one was the maturity point, and that's the one we thought long and hard about. But yeah, it's interesting how the trade-off conversation is often fundamentally self-centered. What fun are you giving up?
Sure, and because that's the narrative that our culture has told us. I mean, they don't make movies about college students who get married. Right? they make movies about fraternities and sororities and crazy stuff like that. The maturity thing is critical. Obviously, if you had and Nancy had thought that your daughter was not mature at 19 years old, you would have counseled her a different way.
Exactly.
And that this is not a one-size-fits-all prescription. Obviously, everyone's different. I remember when I was in seminary, Amanda and I were newlyweds, and I was taking a counseling class, and my professor was talking about marriage and the stat that you alluded to earlier, which is the older people are when they get married, the lower the rate of divorce is. And the younger people are when they get married, statistically speaking, the higher the rate of divorce. So having just gotten married at 23, I went and met with my professor and asked her, like, can I talk to you more about this? Because I just got married. And she said, behind that statistic is not really a prescription that you should wait till you reach a certain age to get married. She said it's really a diagnosis of maturity. And if you are mature at 19 or 20 or 23, then your marriage will probably be fine. If you're immature at 40, your marriage is not going to be fine. That's the factor. But then she said something that I've never forgotten, and I used it frequently when I was a pastor and had to do like premarital counseling and all that. She said the most important thing about two people when they get married is not who they are, it's who they are becoming. And that's the problem, is when you're 19, 20, 23, you might have great compatibility and you decide to get married, but if you're actually becoming two very different people, or you're on two very different trajectories, then 10, 15, 20 years later, you're miles and miles apart from each other. And having come from a household where my parents came from very different cultures, very different religious backgrounds, all that. And eventually, after I was in my 30s, they divorced. That struck a nerve with me, because the question that I had to then wrestle with is, how do I know my wife and I are growing in the same direction? Because as much as we are compatible and we love each other and we made that commitment to each other at 23, how do I know at 43 or 53, at 63, we're going to be as tight? And that's the real kicker. And that comes down to a strong sense of who you are, who you belong to, and are you growing in the same direction? And that's an intentional thing that has to work its way out throughout every year of your marriage.
Yes.
It's not something you just, check off the list and like, we got this, we'll be set for 50 years. Thank you.
Yeah, there's no snapshot version of that analysis. You can, when we're talking about, for example, with Camille, from the age of 10, practically, Camille was like our family theologian. The definition of like the old soul. This was somebody who was not just mature for her age, but was rapidly developing in wisdom and mature. And look, this is my dad. I'm looking at Camille through dad-colored glasses, right?
Sure.
But growing in wisdom and maturity with a guy who was also growing in wisdom and maturity, who was also an old soul in a lot of ways. And there was that real sense of compatibility and forward motion together. And that really told us, and again, you don't know the future, but told us in the moment that this is wise. And with a different person, you might have a very, very different calculus. But what was so unpersuasive to us on the argument was stuff like the have fun in college argument, or the you don't have enough money argument, or those kinds of arguments were unpersuasive. What would have been persuasive is the maturity trajectory argument that you just outlined, but we felt like all of that was pointing towards them being together. And they're proving to be a great couple and great parents. So it's really a blessing to watch them grow. They just had their 5-year anniversary, and Camille's 24, and now people don't necessarily look at them and say, "Oh, you're so young." There are other married law students with kids, for example, and so they don't stand out quite as much. But it's just been a real blessing to see them grow up together and be together. And I would encourage folks to don't just accept immediately that here's this formula, and the formula includes this much later point in life when that's when you're going to start to look for your spouse, or that's when you're ready for marriage, or that's when you're ready for kids. For some folks, that's the case, and God bless you. I'm not casting aspersions on that at all. But what I'm talking about is what's the default? The default going to be to sort of buy into that scenario, or is the default going to be, to maybe question it a little bit?
My oldest is a senior in college. She's starting to have conversations with us about what happens next and looking for jobs and where she's going to live and all this stuff. And over the summer when she was home, she would repeatedly say to me, "I don't feel old enough to be making these kinds of decisions." And I would say to her, "I don't feel old enough to have a kid that's making these kinds of decisions. Like, I still feel like I'm in high school."
Yeah.
So if we are waiting to feel like a grown-up before we start making grown-up decisions, whether it's marriage or having kids or whatever, I'm still waiting for that myself. So, and we did not plan to have kids as early as we did, but I'm so grateful it ended up that way.
At the height of a lot of the concern over Lila, my daughter said, "I'm not sure I'm old. I don't know if I feel old enough to confront all of this." And I said, "Camille, nobody's old enough to confront all of this."
Yeah.
That's one
Absolutely.
of the secrets of growing up that you don't exactly, maybe we should be more transparent about that with our kids, is you feel overmatched all the time.
Mm-hmm.
I'm 54 years old, Skye, and I feel overmatched, many times. I don't think and if you ever reach a point where you say, "I've got this, I can handle all of this," maybe you need to check yourself a little bit, because life is a process of encountering situations that just feel too big, and that doesn't necessarily change.
Yeah, I think it was Dallas Willard who said something like, "The ordinary challenges of life is God's curriculum for spiritual growth."
Yeah. Yeah.
The ordinary challenges of life, they will come. We don't have to worry about it.
This episode is sponsored by Radvo. In an age of polarization and division, it often seems the church is part of the problem, maybe even leading the charge. For a body that is one, holy, Catholic, and apostolic, as the Nicene Creed puts it, we don't always look that way. Radvo, short for Radical Vocation, is a vocations and ministry conference that seeks to bring together clergy and laity from across the church, and especially the Anglican world. We'll gather to hear from some of the church's best theologians on the unity of the church, to worship and to witness to the unity of Christ's body in a divided world in need. If you're considering a call to ordained ministry, if you're curious about Anglicanism, both in North America and around the world, or if you simply love Christ's church and want to see her flourish, this conference is for you. Speakers include Tish Harrison Warren, Amy Peeler, and Stanley Hauerwas. Register today at radvoco.org, radvoco.org, or follow the link in the show notes, and join us September 21st to the 23rd at Church of the Incarnation in Dallas. And thanks to Radvo for sponsoring this episode.
Okay, we have spent most of the time talking about that piece, and I'm grateful. Thank you for that. And I encourage everyone to go read it. But I want to just take the last 15 minutes or so with you to talk about something completely different,
Yes.
which is just a brief update on the state of our politics, and especially on the Republican side of the equation, because the primary kind of got kicked off officially with the first debate, although the front runner, Donald Trump, was not there. And then at the same time that's going on, we have this crazy phenomenon of Trump having been indicted 4 times with 90 some charges against him in these 4 different indictments. It looks like increasingly he is going to be the nominee for the Republican Party. The window of a chance for anyone else to take that away is quickly closing. I just want to hear more of your take on where the party is. And is there any possibility of the Republican Party extricating itself from the Donald Trump cult?
Boy, oh, Skye. So is there any possibility of extricating from the Donald Trump cult? Yes, for sure. There's a possibility. Is there a probability? No. No. So, here's the way I look at it. I look at the Republican debate. You've heard that phrase, the already and the not yet?
Mm-hmm.
Okay,
we talk about that with eschatological theology.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
So I felt like the Republican debate ignored the already and was about the not yet. So here's what I mean. The already is Donald Trump is the dominant force in Republican politics. Anything that isn't about really dealing with Donald Trump, it's not really dealing with what the Republican Party is right now. And that was not much of the debate, quite honestly, last week. It was not much about dealing with Donald Trump at all. I mean, there was a segment of did Pence do the right thing, etc. But so dealing with Donald Trump, that's the already. And nobody knows how to do that. Nobody knows on the GOP. Well, maybe they know and they don't have the will, but nobody has done that on the GOP. And the already is Trump is the overwhelming favorite for the nomination, and nobody knows what to do with that. The not yet part of it is what I felt like what we saw in that debate was almost like a preview of coming attractions. And by that I meant, how is the Republican Party going to fight after Trump? And that was the Vivek and Nikki Haley going at each other. That was the stark differences in ideology and philosophy that you saw on that debate stage. And that's what I think was interesting to me about the debate was, is this the preview of coming attractions of how Republicans will fight after Trump, with somebody like DeSantis sort of saying, no, the real legacy of Donald Trump is my authoritarian politics. And here comes Vivek saying, no, the real after Trump is sort of the show, the presentation, the, watch me just play fast and loose with the truth, watch me be entertaining, watch me be wildly over the top. And so it was sort of like, if you have heard the phrase dinner and a show, it was like DeSantis was the dinner and Vivek was the show of Trumpism. And then you had all these other candidates who were like, no, we don't want the trumpet. That's not who we are. And so Nikki Haley, watching her go back and forth with Vivek, was like watching the old GOP fight the new GOP right in front of you. And so that's how I looked at that debate.
I know the audience in that debate is probably a terrible read on, because they're all politically active people aligned with these campaigns and not representative of the American electorate. But it was so disheartening when, I call him Ramaswamy, but whenever he would spout, I mean, he was so obnoxious and so blatantly ignorant on so many fronts, and yet riled the audience so much. And he's got a bump in the polls in some stats that I've been seeing. Like, it's disheartening if that's where the party is heading post-Trump. I'm worried there isn't going to be a post-Trump because there's no, I mean, who knows how long his natural life will go. His political life, I don't think, is going anywhere. But we just heard from the judge in the case in Washington, D.C., that the trial is going to begin, was it March 4th? The day before Super Tuesday, which means there's a high likelihood that we will get a verdict in that case sometime in the spring. Mm-hmm. And there's a good possibility that the Republican nominee for president could be a convicted felon before the November election. Yeah. Can Trump be on the ticket as a convicted felon? In which case, he's not even able to vote, is he, if you're a convicted felon?
Well, it depends on the state.
Yeah, well, what about federal law?
I don't think Florida has franchised felons, but only after they've completed their sentence. So he could be a convicted felon unable to vote in his own home state.
Can the Republican Party, I don't know if this is a legal question or just a political question, but can the Republican Party allow a convicted felon to
Yes.
be the top of its ticket?
Yes. So there are very limited constitutional qualifications for president. So
Right.
they have to be a certain age. They have to be a natural-born citizen. According to Section 3 of the 14th Amendment, they can't have participated in, aided, and abetted a rebellion against the United States, which is a whole
interesting debate that's going on right now.
whole conversation.
Yeah.
So if you've met these threshold requirements, you can run from president from solitary confinement as a convicted murderer. I mean, but the big but to that is, on the one hand, a lot of folks would say, well, okay, so what? America would never vote for, a convicted felon. Oh, wait, maybe. But the other fail-safe has always been the parties. So the parties can add
Right.
whatever additional requirements they want to add. So the GOP could, in theory, say nobody can get a GOP presidential nomination who's a convicted felon. And they could not, and courts would not set that aside. They would not say, because the GOP is a private institution, it can just set its eligibility criteria. And if it says if you're a convicted felon, sorry, you can't run on a presidential ticket under the Republican banner, they could do that. But Trump could also say, well, okay, I'm going to run as an independent.
Right. Okay. So since 2015, since he descended on that escalator, politicos all over the media have been announcing this is finally what's going to break people's excitement about Donald Trump. It's when he called John McCain a loser for getting captured. It's going to be when he insulted the Gold Star family. It's going to be, one thing after another. Then it became Russiagate, or it became firing Comey, or it became January 6th. This is it. Finally, this is what's going to... 100 different things. Is there any possibility that a jury convicting Donald Trump of federal crimes or even state crimes would be what breaks the GOP's commitment to this guy?
Any possibility, yes. A probability, no.
No.
And so I would say this. There's, what is it, the old Hemingway statement, that how does a company go bankrupt? Slowly, then suddenly. There is a possibility of a Trump collapse in that slowly, then suddenly scenario. In other words, that over time, he just has a lower ceiling, just ever lower ceiling on his support. And then at some point, finally, you kind of break through and people say, okay, even if I like him, we've got to move on. That's the slowly then suddenly scenario. I think the more realistic scenario actually is related to some pretty deep-seated cultural stuff on the right now. Mm-hmm. And that is, there is an incredible animosity to the left combined with this sort of shame honor culture mindset that you see in the South and lots of other parts of the country, where once you get your back up about something, once it becomes a matter of pride or honor, then reason and logic flow out the window, right? And so a lot of what's happened in the Trump world, and I see it, I live in an 85% Trump neighborhood, is the people who want Trump gone are all the people I don't like, and I'm not going to give them an inch. So even if they don't necessarily love Donald Trump, and a lot of people love Donald Trump, there's that Nate Cohn, the Times Siena poll that Nate Cohn wrote about in the Times that shows that about 37% of the GOP electorate is all in for Trump and is going to stay all in for Trump. And with that kind of floor to his support, it's really hard to see how he loses the nomination.
Right.
But there's a larger number who are not all in for Trump. But what they are all in on is not liking the left, or not liking those never Trumpers, or not liking the media. And they're just not going to give their opponents the satisfaction of yielding. And I think that's a dynamic that's underappreciated in this.
So I just wrote a piece for the Holy Post this week about sort of the new lost cause of white evangelicalism. Similar to what happened in the Civil War, there was this shame in the South over losing the Civil War, and they had to come up with a lost cause way of regaining their honor. And I think there's something similar going on today. But it feels a bit like the sunk cost fallacy. Like we've put so much into this guy since 2016, even though Republicans lost the midterms in 2018. They lost the presidency and midterm, or the Congress in 2020. They lost in 2022. They're poised to lose again in 2024. At what point do they decide, even though I want to stick it to the libs, even though I don't want to give my critics the satisfaction of turning on Trump, at some point, don't they want to win an election?
Yeah. Well, here's the interesting thing about that, Skye, and my dispatch friend Nick Cottagio has written about this. Now, in large, a majority of Republicans believe that Trump is the best bet to beat Biden.
And is that because they really believe in Trump's strengths, or have they bought into the things on Fox News and elsewhere that they think Biden is a puppet, senile old person who can't possibly endure a campaign?
Well, it's interesting. A lot of Republicans cannot see Biden winning, like just against anybody. So a lot of that is rooted in the Biden, in thinking that Biden just can't win.
And the irony is, I think if the Republicans nominated anyone but Trump, they probably would beat Biden.
Right. I mean, I'm getting this weird deja vu. In 2016, I feel like the Republicans nominated the only person who was likely to lose to Hillary Clinton, and the Democrats nominated the only person who could lose to Donald Trump.
Right.
And so
exactly.
it was, which,
yes.
And I feel like this is going in 2024, that the Republicans are about to nominate the person who would be most likely to lose to Joe Biden, but the Democrats are renominating somebody who could conceivably lose to Donald Trump. And how is this going to work out? But yeah, what's interesting is, even though Republican voters believe that Biden is very, very beatable and believe Biden is very, very weak, they still believe now, many of them, that Trump is still the best bet of the field. And a lot of this is due to, and again, for those of us who don't inhabit this right-wing media verse, that's not the air that we breathe, it's not the water we swim in, cannot grasp how little the average Republican knows about Trump's weaknesses, both electorally and personally.
Even the indictments and the trials coming up, you don't think are going to break through.
They might
and reveal that.
A lot of it depends on, are there huge unanticipated developments, or there dramatic moments on the stand, that kind of pop culture type, Hollywood type stuff that can cause people to really, react in the middle of a trial. But it really is the case. You saw this poll, and the poll had some problems, I grant. But still, even granting the problems in the poll, the fact that 71% of Republicans trusted Donald Trump to tell them the truth, and only about 42% trusted religious leaders. Look, a lot of that's an indictment of religious leaders that they deserve.
Yeah.
But 71% believing that Donald Trump is going to tell them something true? On what planet are you living? And the answer is Foxland or Foxtopia.
Okay, last question, and I'll finally let you go. Currently, cameras are not allowed in federal courts. Some people are saying that the Chief Justice Roberts can make a decision to allow a camera in a federal trial if he thinks it's in the public interest. And some people are calling for him to do exactly that for this federal trial of Trump beginning on March 4th. Do you think that he should allow a camera into that courtroom? And what's the likelihood of this happening? Or is this just a fantasy that will never occur?
I don't think the cameras will be in the federal courtroom.
Do you think they should be for this case?
I'm going to say no. Okay.
Why?
And so here's why. So this is my small c to conservatism coming out. Of all of the branches of government that have functioned the best in the era of Trump, the federal judiciary is the best. It is head and shoulders above Congress. Congress has been pathetic. And when I say Congress, really what I mean is, especially in holding Trump accountable, Republicans in Congress.
Well, the judiciary is not subject to voters.
Right.
So they're immune to that.
So Congress has been a profile in cowardice. Republicans in Congress have been a profile in cowardice. The executive branch, when Trump's the head of it in particular, has been a disaster. But quite frankly, the judiciary helped save American democracy. And so the small c conservative in me does not look at the judiciary and say, it's perfect. I would like to see better ethics rules for federal judges, for example, to deal with the Clarence Thomas Sotomayor problems that we've seen. So it's not that I think that is perfect, but I am resistant to dramatic change when it is the one branch that's working better than any others. And I do think that the introduction of cameras into the courtroom has just as much a chance of degrading the process as it does of demonstrating to Americans how serious the process is.
But I understand the objection to allowing cameras broadly into federal courts. But what about just this one trial, given the fact that this is the Republican candidate for the presidency? He's been indicted for an issue directly related to his ability to fulfill his constitutional oath as president. Do the people deserve to see this happen so that they can have faith in the process,
Well,
whatever the outcome?
I'm going to again say no, and I'm going to say no for a different reason. And this one is, and I'm going to use one of the most famous trials in American history, O.J. Simpson. Okay, here's a problem, Skye. If you are a viewer watching a trial, you are not watching what the jury sees. And that's a really, really important point if you're wanting to talk about the integrity of the system and the public perception of the integrity of the system. Because if you're able to watch a trial on TV, you're not just watching the evidence that the jury sees, you're also watching all the arguments that the jury does not get to see. And you also get to see the evidence that has been denied to the jury, because evidence that's denied to the jury is argued about in court, but not with the jury present. And if you watched of, say, if you watched the O.J. Simpson trial from start to finish, like I did, went back in the day, if you watched the O.J. Simpson trial, you had a different view of the case in many ways than a juror did, because the juror only saw what the judge permitted them to see evident, and you saw everything. So if you're a viewer watching the trial, unless you're a quite sophisticated lawyer who can parse out, okay, here's my evaluation of what the jury is seeing versus my evaluation of what is all else is going on, you're not actually getting the picture of the trial in the way that is most meaningful, and that is what the jury sees.
Is there any example of a trial, federal or state, where the cameras are only on when the jury is present?
I've never seen that. That would be interesting. That would be interesting. But, like the most recent public trial, the Amber Heard Johnny Depp trial. Mm-hmm. Watching the public commentary around that made me want to. I just wanted to remove myself to a cabin in the woods somewhere and just not even look at it, because the way in which people reacted to evidentiary rulings, the way in which people responded to the trial was so wildly opposite sort of how these things actually, how the jury actually processes a case. And so I just see a lot of danger there when you're talking about the one branch of government that is functioning the best. So that's my small c conservatism coming out, Skye.
It would be fascinating if the cameras were allowed to compare how like an MSNBC versus a Fox News is covering the exact same thing, and the spin that would go on, and the interpretive lens through which their audience would be exposed to the trial would be incredibly weird.
You'll get to see a televised Trump trial in Fulton County, Georgia. Cameras are allowed. Now that's if he doesn't succeed in removing the case to federal court. But so, you might see both. You might have both the non-televised federal trial and a televised state trial that would be likely to happen afterwards. And some of the defendants in the case have sought a speedy trial, and so they may be tried even this year in Georgia. And so we might see some of that, on television prior to the Trump trial. So, we could have a social experiment in both ways of doing it.
Regardless, it's hard for me to imagine an outcome next November, in which Trump loses that isn't worse than the last time. Whether he's convicted in one or more of these trials and he loses the election in November, like in what case does he go, yeah, you got me, I'll go peacefully to jail, or yeah, I lost the election, good on you, Joe Biden, hope your second term is success. Like, there's no scenario in which this doesn't end in a catastrophe for the country.
Oh.
And it brings me back to what we talked about before we were recording. I'm just so upset that all the other political leaders in the Republican Party, in Congress, in the Senate, didn't do their responsibility and protect the country and uphold their constitutional oath and protect the country from this mess. And now we're left with the courts to do it and the election to do it, and it's going to be a disaster no matter what the outcome.
You know, Skye, when you look at American history, you have some what ifs, right? So what if the Continental, the Continental Army was commanded by somebody other than George Washington? What if it's commanded by Charles Lee, or heaven forbid, Benedict Arnold, right? What if Abraham Lincoln was somebody other than Abraham Lincoln, right? And you can go through American history, and one of the things about American history that's really interesting is that at very key times, we have had some pretty remarkable people emerge. But then there have been some very key times when remarkable people have not emerged, and we have suffered for it. Yeah. So think about the election of 1876 and the compromise around 1876 that ended Reconstruction and essentially threw Black America to the segregationists and created and empowered this Jim Crow world that we're still living with the consequences of. That's what happens when people don't have courage, moral courage, right? And I really fear that we're going to be living for maybe a long time with the consequences of the moral cowardice of the GOP in the Senate in 2021. And I don't think there's any way to put it as other than moral cowardice. And we're living with those consequences now. We may have violent consequences of it in 2024. We could have violent consequences of it in 2028. I mean, there is, think about this. If Mike Pence had said yes, right, we could have had something approaching an 1861 level constitutional crisis. What could happen in 2024 that could replicate something like that? And so I feel like we're living through one of these alternative historical scenarios, which is a crisis, but no courage, or not a sufficient amount of courage.
Well, on that happy note,
right.
Enjoy your Labor Day weekend. I hope you do get time to play with your grandkids. And we'll talk again next month with the next installment of French Friday. But thanks again for your time and for the wisdom that you've shared and perspective, both in your writing and on the show.
Well, thanks so much, Skye. And until next month.
French Friday is a production of Holy Post Media, featuring David French and me, Skye Jethani. Music and theme song by Phil Vischer. This show is made possible by Holy Post patrons. To find out how you can become a Holy Post patron and to find more common good Christian content, go to holypost.com.